This is the introduction to Death and Disorder, A History of Early Modern England, 1485 to 1690 by Ken Macmillan. From the accession of the Tudor dynasty in 1485 to the immediate aftermath of the Revolution of 1688, England experienced significant political, religious, intellectual, legal, economic, and social developments that continue to have relevance in many countries around the world today. This period saw the beginnings of the Westminster system of government and the creation of an enduring Church of England. Extraordinary literary achievements, such as the plays of William Shakespeare, the development of modern scientific methods, as exemplified in the work of Sir Isaac Newton, and the beginnings of the British Empire. By the end of the 17th century, these and other developments made England a key figure in global affairs, well on its way to becoming a modern, quote, great power, end quote. If England in 1485 was a minor and backward nation with insular and xenophobic tendencies, the same certainly cannot be said of England in 1690. While seeking to offer readers an introduction to this important historical period, this book focuses the narrative somewhat by looking in greater depth at two of the most overarching themes in early modern England, namely death from causes other than old age, the disorder that often accompanied it. During this period, various political and dynastic crises saw the assassination of great officers of state and several kings and queens, an event known as regicide. Securing loyalty and heirs encouraged monarchs to charge their nobles and gentlemen with treason, which usually resulted in swift execution. Wars and rebellions saw the death of many thousands of English subjects, either on the field of battle or as retribution in the aftermath. Changes in England's religion also resulted in many deaths, both of Catholics who refused to convert to Protestantism or capitulate to the demands of the state, and Protestants who were unwilling to return to Catholicism when monarchs so demanded. These 2 centuries were also the peak period of execution in English history, far more so than the medieval period that preceded it and the modern period that followed. All serious crimes upset the social order and therefore were felonies punishable by hanging at the gallows, burning at the stake, drawing and quartering, or beheading. Most of these forms of death were carried out in presence of large crowds to act as a deterrent and to show the authority of the state over English subjects. This period also saw the publication of hundreds of pamphlets and trial accounts that described heinous acts of killing perpetrated by disorderly subjects against their parents, spouses, children, masters, servants, and neighbors. Using murder and execution as their primary theme, these sources reinforced the power of the monarch, state, and church and the importance of order in English society. There were many other causes of death and disorder too, such as an extremely high rate of infant mortality, the frequency of plague in crowded cities, attempts to conquer New World inhabitants through violence, and the limited ability of early modern medicine to deal with serious illness. Whatever its cause, whether mercifully swift or agonizingly slow, death was recognized in this society as inevitable, universal, and because many believed that eternal bliss awaited in the afterlife, even desirable. The culture of death was so pervasive that themes of carpe diem, seize the day, memento mori, remember you will die, danse macabre, dance of death, and ars moriendi, art of dying, infused the period's literature, artwork, religion, and thought. In short, early modern England suffered from, to quote historian J.A. Sharp, a, quote, crisis of mortality. I'm not reading the footnotes, so if you want to look at the footnotes, you're going to have to do it yourself. I must emphasize from the outset that early modern England was not a draconian bloodbath of death and disorder. This was not a society out of control, nor, to use Christopher Hill's phrase, a, quote, world turned upside down, end quote. It was not, despite depictions in television, movies, and historical novels, one in which people constantly feared for their lives from despotic kings, tyrannical nobles, abusive husbands, evil witches, or bands of marauders murdering their way through the countryside. On the contrary, many people carried out perfectly orderly and ordinary lives, although everybody who lived during this period experienced a great deal more exposure to death than most of us do today. England was a nation obsessed with order, and it is often through death that order was restored to a society that otherwise had few mechanisms to do so. I must also emphasize that this book is not a chronicle of death in early modern England, nor a study of the beliefs and practices surrounding death, both of which have been expertly examined by others, explored in Explored in and of itself, death through murder, execution, assassination, war, plague, and other means is not a particularly valuable way to learn about the complexities of early modern English history, nor do I seek to glorify or romanticize death or criticize those who caused it, all of which are beyond the purview of the historian. Rather, this book uses vignettes of death and disorder as, I hope, an interesting and provocative way to introduce readers to some of the key events of English history during this time. My choice is to focus on death and disorder serves to enhance the core skills that students of history must develop: understanding cause and effect relationships, assessing continuity and change over time, enhancing critical thinking, showing empathy for those who lived and died in the past, and undertaking deeper scholarly inquiry into topics of personal interest. However, while death and disorder serve as entry points into the broader themes of early modern English history, it is not my purpose to undermine or ignore the traditional narrative, which offers important foundational knowledge for readers new to the subject and is necessary background for students who wish to advance into more specialized areas of English, British, imperial, political, religious, and social history. The overarching theme of death and disorder are meant to exist alongside and enliven, but are not meant to displace or subvert other historical developments in early modern England. Organization. This book is organized into 3 parts: the Tudors, 1485 to 1603, the Stuarts, 1603 to 1690, Empire and Society. Parts 1 and 2 employ traditional chapter structures following the reigns of successive monarchs in a manner that is common in many textbooks on the subject. These parts are designed to facilitate the delivery of material consistent with how many courses on early modern England are taught. Part 3 is more wide-ranging, covering a variety of subjects that require examination beyond chronological periodization, such as the rise of empire, elite, and popular culture, and life cycles. To an extent, the final few chapters are designed to introduce readers to the ordinary people of early modern England, rather than focusing on monarchs, politics, and religion, which tend to dominate the first 2 parts. Adhering to the overarching themes of this book, each chapter begins with a death and disorder vignette, an introduction of sorts that describes the death of one or more people and the disorder with which it was closely related. These tales are instructive in themselves, but also shed some light on the topics covered in the chapter. Each chapter ends with a, quote, "Voices of the Past," end quote, section, which includes an extract from a primary source, such as a historical treatise, pamphlet, or other descriptions drawn from contemporary printed documents. These sources reflect some of the themes discussed in the chapters and introduce readers to the type of materials historians use to understand and contextualize the past. These narratives show the descriptions of death and disorder that early modern readers were exposed to, which framed their understanding of various causes and consequences associated with certain unwanted behavior. Like all historical sources, these documents also reveal biases based on factors such as authorship, intended readership, and contemporary political, religious, and social concerns that the authors wittingly or unwittingly passed on to their audiences. Learning how to interrogate documents of this nature for their arguments, biases, and value, learning how to interrogate documents of this nature for their arguments, biases, and value, both to early modern readers and modern historians, is yet another core skill for the student of history to develop. Each chapter also has a series of 5 discussion questions interspersed throughout the narrative, the answer to which might require knowledge gained in earlier chapters of additional inquiry. It is my hope that teachers and students will use these various components of the book in combination with the main narrative in each chapter to engage more deeply with and to critically investigate the history of early modern England during collaborative in-class activities such as, quote, buzz group, end quote, and, quote, think, pair, share, end quote, sessions, and in course assignments that promote research and inquiry into topics that pique individual interest. I should end by reiterating that although this book is designed to offer readers an introduction to the history of early modern England, it is not intended to be comprehensive. Many topics are discussed only briefly and are worthy of further investigation. The further resources section at the end of the book can be used as a means of starting this research. Part 1. The Tudors, 1485 to 1603. Historians often consider the arrival of the Tudors to the English throne in 1485 to signal the end of medieval and the start of early modern England. This process did not, of course, occur overnight, and although some scholars have claimed that the Tudor age represented a significant amount of change from its medieval past, particularly in areas such as religion and intellectual ideas, others have argued that there was also a great deal of continuity, particularly in areas such as government and social organization. The five Tudor monarchs, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, together make up perhaps the best-known royal dynasty in English history, if not all of Western Europe. Once the Tudors forged their dynasty through conquest, they fought hard to gain loyalty from their subjects and recognition from other European rulers. Efforts to strengthen the power of the central government and change religion to a form consistent with Protestant worship caused dissension among nobles and commoners alike, which led to numerous rebellions that were violently suppressed throughout the 16th century. The accession to the monarchy of a young boy and two women led to infighting among senior advisors and the upper nobility, and various attempts to restore order resulted in much taking of life. Okay. So that's a little introduction to this part. Now, Chapter 1. Establishing the Tudor dynasty. Death and disorder. The Battle of Bosworth Field. The Battle of Bosworth Field began the Tudor dynasty and brought an end to the Wars of the Roses, a series of disorderly events that pitted the Yorkist and Lancasterian lines of the English royal family against one another. By 1485, the king was Richard III, head of the Yorkist line, who is best known for orchestrating the deaths of his nephews, 12-year-old Edward V, king from April to July 1483, and his 9-year-old brother, Richard, Duke of York. Young Edward had become king upon the death of his father, Edward IV. But as a minor, he needed adult supervision in the form of Lord Protector. The job was taken up by Edward's uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had been a faithful servant to his brother, and was a natural and experienced choice for the council's leadership. Rather than rally in support of his nephew, however, Richard met the young king en route to London and escorted him to lodgings in the Tower of London, where he was soon joined by his younger brother. While the princes resided in the Tower, Richard declared his brother's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid on slim legal grounds, which made their children bastards and thus ineligible to claim the throne. With the support of Parliament, the throne therefore passed to Richard, who became Richard III. From 1483 to 1485. The two boys were never seen again, and Richard quickly became English history's most legendary villain, in part because of William Shakespeare's famous portrayal of him as an immoral and deformed murderer of children. Nearly 2 centuries later, workmen at the Tower unearthed a wooden box under a staircase containing 2 human skeletons the size of preteen children. Richard's usurpation of the crown and probable murder of his nephews quickly led to uprisings throughout southern and western England and a resumption of the Wars of the Roses. Richard III's opponent was Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, nominal head of the Lancastrian line, through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, great-granddaughter of John the Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Henry's bloodline, however, was tainted. His mother descended from Catherine Swynford, Gaunt's mistress, which prevented Henry from a natural succession to the throne and made him an unlikely Lancastrian. Challenger. Lancastrian challenger. If Henry was to claim the throne and secure his dynasty, therefore, it would have to be by right of conquest on the field of battle. After several months of planning and gathering troops and supporters, Henry and Richard clashed at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on August 22, 1485. Henry arrived on the field of battle with several thousand mercenary troops from Scotland and Normandy, accompanied by defecting Yorkist and Woodville supporters. The king's army was larger, estimated at around 10,000 men. Despite Henry's numerical inferiority, his army proved better at close combat and held its ground. And one of Richard's battle groups seems to have slowed its attack either out of rebellion against Richard or because the landscape made forward movement difficult. Meanwhile, Richard decided to take the battle directly to Henry by moving several mounted men toward the rear, where armed guards protected Henry. Richard seemed poised for success. He needed only take out Henry's guard and kill his rival. The turning point in the battle came from Sir William Stanley, the brother of Henry Tudor's stepfather, Lord Thomas Stanley. When the king was separated from the main battle and Henry's bodyguards were becoming overwhelmed, Stanley sent his troops into battle against Richard. As Stanley's forces pushed Richard several hundred yards from Henry, the king's horse stumbled and he lost his helmet, upon which also rested a coronet, a small open crown. It is doubtful that Richard III uttered Shakespeare's famous line, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," but this unhorsing led to his death by a single blow of a halberd. According to one 16th century historian, Lord Thomas officially ended the battle by retrieving the falling coronet from under a bush and placing it on Henry's head, symbolically beginning the Tudor dynasty. The Battle of Bosworth Field brought an end of the 30-year conflict known as the War of the Roses, which saw the death of many thousands of English subjects and the killing of 3 kings, including Edward V and Richard III, an act known as regicide. There can be no question that the Tudor dynasty began in bloodshed. Discussion question 1.1. Why was it important for Henry Tudor to be crowned with Richard III's coronet on the field of battle after Bosworth? New section. England in 1485. At the end of the 15th century, the English nation was literally and figuratively insular. Together with Scotland in the north and Wales in the west, England is one of 3 nations on the island of Albion, a term used by classical geographers and poets to describe what is today known as Great Britain. It was also at 130,000 square kilometers, the largest of the 3 nations, although England was much smaller by land size and by population than France, Spain, and what was then known as the Holy Roman Empire. England is physically separated from continental Europe by the English Channel, which historically provided both natural protection against military invasion, though this did occur, especially in 1066 and 1688, and a sense of distinction from other European nations. England had, for example, its own common law, which developed very differently from the brands of law used on the continent, a fact that many English people rarely tired of repeating. These differences, however, should not be exaggerated. During the early modern period, England involved itself in numerous continental wars, and English subjects traveled to Europe and traded for goods that England, by virtue of its climate, could not produce itself, such as olive oil and wine. English gentlemen attended European universities and returned with new ideas about art, religion, learning, science, and politics, the impact of which was clearly seen in English society. Moreover, England developed the same feudal structure that most European countries possessed, and partly as a result also used similar systems of government, rank structures, and economies. Thus, although early modern England certainly had its own history, there were many parallels between what was going on in England and the affairs of continental Europe. Although its nation and people were more insular than many Europeans, it is a mistake to accept blindly early modern English subjects' claim to the uniqueness of their society. In 1485, England's population was about 2 million people, much smaller than the modern figure exceeding 50 million. The population had been higher in the 14th century, perhaps approaching 4 million before the Black Death of 1348 to 49 wiped out a third to half of England's population. It would take until nearly 1700 for the population to return to its pre-plague level, a doubling of the population during the 16th and 17th centuries that caused numerous problems, including food shortages, inflation, unemployment, and the significant increase in poverty. By comparison, France and the Holy Roman Empire each had about 15 million people, Italy 10 million, and the Iberian countries of Spain and Portugal 7 million. This demography helps to explain why France, Italy, and the Empire tended to dominate the politics of early modern Europe. For administrative purposes, England was divided into several dozen counties or shires, each of different size according to its location and population. Most of the population lived in the south and east parts of England, from about Herefordshire in the west across to Essex in the east, and all parts south, including Cornwall, Devon, and the home counties, in which lies London. This region was more populated because its landscape was flatter, its soil more fertile, and its weather milder, allowing for a longer growing season for crops. The north and west parts of England were mountainous and rocky, with thin soil and a shorter growing season. The south also boasted Westminster, England's administrative capital, immediately adjacent to which was London, England's most populous city and its largest port. Bisecting London was the Thames River, which allowed for the movement of goods and access to the English Channel and Europe via the port of Dover in nearby Kent. This population distribution remained largely static until the onset of the Industrial Revolution towards the end of the 18th century. About 10% of English people lived in urban environments or cities exceeding 5,000 inhabitants. London was by far the largest, having a population of around 50,000 in 1500, 200,000 by 1600, and more than 500,000 by 1700. Other large cities included business centers such as Bristol, Coventry, Exeter, and Newcastle, the cathedral cities of Canterbury, Lincoln, Salisbury, and York, and the university cities of Oxford and Cambridge. In total, perhaps 30 communities had populations exceeding 5,000 residents. Naturally, a wide swath of society populated these cities, from beggars and servants to artisans, tradespeople, government officials, and the aristocracy. Most of society, about 80%, lived in the rural countryside, in communities ranging from 50 to perhaps 1,000 inhabitants. The larger of these were market towns in which farmers, artisans, and merchants bought and sold crops and supplies in exchange for ready money or barter. Smaller communities, villages, hamlets, or parishes, because their inhabitants worshipped at the same church, numbered in the thousands. The church, the house of the manorial lord, and village square were the main features in these villages and were often very vibrant places. They hosted festivals and markets during certain times of the year, traveling troops and tradesmen, and the administration of law and order, weddings and funerals, and news of goings-on beyond their small communities, often proclaimed in church on Sundays by the priest or landlord. Several of these villages were grouped together into administrative units known as, quote, hundreds, end quote, presided over by mayors, reeves, and elders, quote, aldermen, end quote. Discussion question 1.2. Why do you think that England was so insular from Europe and the world at the end of the medieval period? New section. The English social structure. England in 1485, like most of Europe, was a late feudal society. Although feudalism no longer shared many characteristics with its origins hundreds of years earlier, vassals providing homage, rent, and service to lords in exchange for personal protection, early modern England maintained the orderly hierarchy that feudalism created. The hierarchy was also taught and enforced by the Roman Catholic Church, which placed man within a larger, quote, great chain of being, end quote, including God, angels, animals, plants, stones, and the damned. Other than the omnipresent God, each link in the chain was subdivided into, for example, 9 ranks of angels, nobles, lions, the ignoble, snakes, animals, and mighty trees, and lowly weeds, plants, etc. Sorry for sniffling. Man was also subdivided, particularly between what later commentators such as Sir Thomas Smith and William Harrison would refer to as, quote, men and who rule, end quote, and, quote, men who do not rule, end quote. At the top of the men who ruled was the king, a ruler who, by God's divine authority, was the fount of all wisdom and justice, and a natural ruler of lesser men. Monarchs usually came to their position by right of succession through male primogeniture, which entitled the former king's eldest son or closest male heir, a brother or uncle, to inherit. The monarch was believed to be endowed with what political commentator John Fortescue referred to in the late 15th century as, quote, angel intelligence, end quote, or intellectual powers that could not be attained by other mortals. These powers enabled the monarch to rule effectively in the best interest of his people and commonwealth. Next were the nobles, starting with the temporal nobility, dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons. The king granted these titles to those who made valuable contributions to the realm through military or administrative service, or they were inherited by right of male primogeniture. In the traditional feudal system, these men were, quote, tenants-in-chief, end quote, which means they held land directly from the king and owed him homage, allegiance, and certain financial obligations. Historically, at the time of their creation, dukes, of which there were only 4 in 1485, were usually closely related by blood to the king, as uncles, brothers, or sons, for example. Marquises, or Marquises, I don't know how you pronounce that, Marquesses, at least initially, governed the English, quote, marchlands, end quote, separating England from Wales and Scotland. Earls, known as counts in the rest of Europe, governed the countencies and were often named after the major city in the country where they held their property. Viscounts, once a title given to sheriffs, vicecomes in Latin, or vicecomes in Latin, and barons, lesser landholders could hold their title from the king, but many also held them as courtesy titles, assumed by the eldest sons of greater nobles until they inherited their father's loftier titles. In 1485, there were about 50 noble families whose income came from rents paid by their many feudal tenants. They also often possessed considerable wealth, sometimes accumulated over centuries, which allowed these families to live in splendor, although there were many poorer barons among them. Their lands and estates were often vast, and they retained large affinities, gentlemen and servants who served the needs of these great lords. Among this group were also the younger sons of nobles who would not inherit their father's title, but who were nonetheless wealthy because they were well placed into professions such as law, the military, the church, and government service. Get some water. The spiritual nobility included leaders of the English branch of the Roman Catholic Church, including cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and abbots who headed the monasteries, totaling about 60 clerics. These men were appointed by the Pope on recommendation from the king, but in practice it was the king's decision. Although less wealthy generally than their temporal counterparts, but some, like Cardinal Wolsey, during the reign of Henry VIII, were extremely wealthy. Spiritually, lords also lived extravagantly. From the tithes collected from their parishioners, the rents paid by tenants who lived on church lands, and the fact that the church lands were not taxed. Both the temporal and spiritual lords were entitled to sit in the House of Lords, the upper branch of the English Parliament, and many also assumed the roles of royal advisers and great officers of state. Beneath the nobility was a larger group of men, numbering approximately 3,000 in 1485, known as the landed gentry. At the top of this group were knights whose title was created by the king and was not technically inheritable, although heirs commonly paid a fee to the king in exchange for knighthood. Achieving knightly status was often the result of important military, administrative, or other services to the king or government. Next were esquires, which were usually courtesy titles rather than individually bestowed. They were adopted by men who served certain political officers and by the eldest sons of nobles and knights. The largest group among the gentry were, quote, mere, and, quote, gentlemen, men with sufficient wealth to apply for a coat of arms from the heralds of the College of Arms. These men were, quote, landed, end quote, because they held lands either directly from the king or from the nobles and rented the land to tenants, with the rent serving as their main source of income. Most gentlemen and their wives, sons, and daughters lived lives of plenty and often could afford to keep numerous servants. They were also the, quote, natural rulers of society, end quote, because they served in various local offices, justice of the peace, sheriff, mayor, alderman, and were thus a regular presence in royal governance. They could also stand for election as members of the House of Commons, the lower branch of Parliament. In total, the nobility and gentry, or the aristocracy, composed about 2% of society. Below the gentry was a larger group, about 10% of society, known, depending in part on whether they lived in urban or rural environments, as citizens and yeomen. These men had enough wealth, 40 shillings in freehold property, to own property and to vote, although they might themselves not have enough income to run for such a position. In the cities or boroughs, whose parliamentary representatives were known as burgesses, or, quote, burgesses, end quote, these men included what would later be termed the professionals or middling sort. They included university professors, lawyers, physicians, clergymen, teachers, merchants, master artisans, and by virtue of their offices, certain members of the royal administration. These professionals often had similar wealth and authority to the gentry, but their lack of, quote, landed, end quote, status generally placed them lower on the social hierarchy of English society, which was not based solely on economic wealth. Yeomen were farmers who held their land in freehold tenure, roughly equivalent to modern notions of private property ownership. They farmed enough land or raised enough livestock to sell the surplus at market for profit rather than merely living a subsistence lifestyle, and were able to employ farm laborers, though, unlike most gentlemen, they also worked their land themselves and some household servants. Their position in society required citizens and yeomen to serve in various local capacities, such as constables and jurymen. At the lower ranks of the English social hierarchy were those, quote, who do not rule, end quote, comprising about 75% of society. These people were known as copyholders and cottagers who rented modest parcels of land from those higher in the chain. Many of these men, their wives and children, also worked in what was known as the, quote, cottage industry, end quote, performing various low-skilled artisanal activities such as spinning during slow times in the farming calendar to make extra money and support their subsistence lifestyle. Lower still on the chain were apprentices and journeymen who worked for many years to develop the skills that might enable them to become master artisans and climb into the ranks of the citizenry. At the bottom of the recognized hierarchy were field laborers who typically worked daily or seasonally and lived in extremely modest dwellings, menial servants, men and women, who served others and usually lived in the homes or outbuildings of their lords and masters. All of these lower-ranking people were commonly and not derisively referred to as the, quote, laboring poor, end quote, and were respected because their labor was essential to maintain the lifestyle of those higher up the chain. officially unrecognized in English society, though possibly comprising about 5% of its inhabitants, were the, quote, sturdy beggars, end quote. Mostly living in the large cities, these were the vagrants, vagabonds, and other unwanted members of society who, it was argued, had the ability to work but chose not to do so. Instead, they traveled the countryside seeking alms and handouts, living under bridges and pitching temporary tents in forests and fields. They were deemed, quote, strangers, end quote, because they did not have a community that acknowledged them or masters to rule over them. These men, women, and children had virtually no legal status, and in a society that lacked any form of social welfare, and later distinguished between the deserving or the, quote, laboring, end quote, and undeserving, or the, quote, idle, end quote, poor, when determining whether to direct charity, were badly mistreated in early modern English society by both the official legal system and by vigilante justice. Perhaps surprisingly to the modern reader, those who lived in early modern England were by and large satisfied with the social hierarchy, although there were at times uprisings and rebellions that suggested otherwise. There was little talk of equality of ranks or genders. People were often more concerned about People were more often concerned about falling down the ladder due to poor circumstances than climbing up it through hard work or advantageous marriages, although improvement did happen for some, especially among the nobility and gentry. Moreover, the rulers of society were visibly distinguishable, a perpetual reminder of the great chain of being. The wealthy wore robes, satin, silk, velvet, gold, and swords, while the poor wore cheap wool and muted browns. In fact, a series of English, quote, sumptuary laws, end quote, passed in the 16th century prohibited men and women from wearing certain types of clothing, fabrics, or accessories unless they were of a certain social rank or earned a minimum amount of money annually. Forms of address also depended on a person's rank and position. The king and queen were, quote, your majesty, end quote. A duke, quote, your grace, end quote. Nobles, quote, my lord, end quote, and, quote, my lady, end quote. Gentlemen, quote, sir, end quote, and, quote, squire. Citizens and professionals, quote, doctor, end quote, professor, end quote, or, quote, master, end quote. Yeoman, quote, goodman, end quote, and, quote, goodwife, end quote. Servants, quote, sirrah, end quote. Forenames, quote, William, end quote, or surnames, quote, Jones, end quote, depending on their age and position. Securing the Tudor crown. Given the dubious legitimacy of his elevation to the kingship by right of natural succession, Henry Tudor relied on his victory at Bosworth to claim the crown by right of military conquest and also by God's will and favor, which Henry claimed had allowed his smaller army to prevail. Henry's first Parliament, which met on November 7, 1485, dutifully acknowledged both these claims and recognized their new king as Henry VII. Henry was careful, however, to ensure that Parliament recognized his title rather than granted it to him. According to the standards of medieval and early modern monarchy, as we have seen, kings were selected rex de gratia, by the grace of God, rather than by men or by institutions of government. Parliamentary selection of a king would set a poor precedent for the notion of natural succession by male primogeniture. Even divine intervention and parliamentary support were not enough to ensure that the Yorkist faction or the English nobility would accept Henry VII without challenge. The weakening of the power and wealth of the monarchy over the previous century had resulted in English nobles having virtually king-like powers in their own countries, a condition that was of some concern to the new king who, one, wanted to secure his crown against possible usurpers, and two, wished to restore the monarchy to its earlier prestige under powerful rulers such as Edward I. It can be argued that Henry's reign was above all else about achieving these two goals. One potential problem facing Henry was solved when, 5 months after becoming king, he followed through with an earlier promise to marry Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. This marriage served a number of key purposes. It restored Edward IV's children to legitimacy, removed Elizabeth as a potential claimant to the throne, united the Yorkist, Lancastrian, and Tudor factions together. The Tudor emblem later became a small white rose nestled inside a larger red one, and placed into question the legitimacy of Richard III's rule, and thus that of anyone later claiming to be the heir of Richard. The birth of Prince Arthur, a name intended to remind people of Henry's Welsh lineage and his ancestry back to the fabled King Arthur, in September 1486, ensured that the heir to the throne was of mixed Yorkist and Lancastrian blood. By employing Yorkists in his administration and continuing the policies and practices of his predecessors, Henry managed to secure the loyalty of many Yorkists without having to resort to extreme measures, although he found it necessary to do this as well. Nobles and gentlemen who fought against Henry at Bosworth were attainted by Parliament, which means they were found guilty of crimes against the king and were subject to the loss of their lands and titles. Henry stayed most of the attainders on condition of loyalty and good behavior. Still, a series of challengers for the throne emerged over Henry's first decade as king. The main contenders were the heirs of the siblings of Richard III. Had Richard died a natural death, the crown would have descended to 10-year-old Edward, Earl of Warwick, Richard's nephew by his brother George, or to John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, son of Richard's sister Elizabeth, and possibly, given Warwick's youth, Richard's own choice of heir. Warwick was swiftly apprehended and placed into the Tower of London, but in 1487 a boy named Lambert Simnel claimed, at the behest of his tutor, that he was Warwick, having escaped from the Tower. Simnel was brought into Ireland and was crowned in Dublin as Edward VI. Meanwhile, Lincoln schemed with his aunt Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, sister to Edward IV and Richard III, and sailed to Ireland with 2,000 mercenary troops. The Yorkist army arrived in Lancashire, England, in June 1487, but was defeated by the king's army at the Battle of Stoke. During the battle, Lincoln was killed and Simnel was captured. When it became clear that Simnel was merely a puppet in the whole affair, he was pardoned and employed as a scullery boy in the royal kitchen, eventually rising through the ranks to become the king's falconer. A few years later, another impostor appeared, this time in the person of Perkin Warbeck, who was alleged to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes of the Tower, and second son of Edward IV. In a conspiracy once again hatched by Margaret of Burgundy, Warbeck was widely touted as the legitimate king and was recognized as such in several European courts, including that of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. Warbeck and his supporters staged several rebellions between 1495 and 1497, but none were successful. In 1497, Warbeck was captured, confessed to his subterfuge, and was initially granted a reprieve by Henry and placed under a light guard. After Warbeck attempted to escape to the continent, however, he was recaptured and placed into the Tower of London in a room next to the real Earl of Warwick, who had then been imprisoned for more than a decade. By 1499, Warbeck and Warwick managed to escape. They were quickly recaptured, convicted of high treason, and executed in November. Warwick, by virtue of his high station, was beheaded, while Warbeck, a mere commoner, was strangulated by hanging. Although he had managed to deal effectively with individuals with potential Yorkist claims to the throne, Henry had to go further to secure the crown for his children. One key step was ensuring that he was accepted by other important dignitaries in Europe. Henry managed to obtain from Pope Innocent VII a papal bull that excommunicated all pretenders to the throne of England. Additional foreign support came through the Treaty of Medina del Campo with the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1489. Spain was in the process of emerging as a united nation through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella and the final stages of the Reconquista, by which Christians finally managed to repel the Muslims who had dominated the Iberian Peninsula since the Middle Ages. An alliance with England was a good way to provide security for both nations, particularly with regard to France, no friend of England or Spain. The treaty ensured that both nations would, if needed, provide military support against France. It also arranged a marriage between Henry's eldest son and heir, Arthur, to Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter, Catherine of Aragon. The two were married by proxy in 1499, not coincidentally the same year that Henry had managed to rid himself of the final two potential rivals to the throne, Warwick and Warbeck. The marriage rites were completed 2 years later in November 1501, when both parties were deemed old enough to consummate the relationship. By April 1502, however, Arthur was dead from an unknown illness, most likely tuberculosis. The new heir was Henry, the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Almost immediately, plans were put into motion to marry Prince Henry to his brother's widow, Catherine, which involved securing a papal dispensation for Pope Julius II. For various reasons, the wedding did not take place until shortly after Henry inherited the crown in 1509. Nonetheless, the marriage was important as it upheld the spirit of Medina del Campo and maintained a key relationship between England, Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, a significant political force. Maintained a key relationship between England, Spain, and the Holy Roman Emperor, a significant political figure to have as an ally. Additional foreign support for Henry VII's crown came from King James IV of Scotland. James had supported Warbeck's efforts to claim the throne, and his close association with France meant that he was a threat to the security of the Tudor dynasty. Rather than meet this threat with force, James and Henry agreed to the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, which also involved an arranged marriage between Henry's eldest daughter Margaret and James, from whom the Stuart dynasty, beginning in 1603, would descend. New section. Early Tudor kingship. Let's get some water. With his Yorkist rivals dead or assuaged, a young and healthy heir to the throne, and key alliances with other European royal families, Henry VII managed to secure his crown. But it was also necessary for the king who had brought an end to the Wars of the Roses to strengthen the power and wealth of the English monarchy, the weakness of which had been the cause of the conflict in the first place. By most accounts, Henry was well suited for kingship. He was tall, slender, and strong. He was intelligent and hard-working, and sought advice from his advisers, and he was willing to punish his enemies, but also to reward loyalty. Henry also recognized that a king and his court must be magnificent. The king's subjects and the court's main purpose... The king should live in greater splendor and dress more richly than the wealthiest of his subjects. The court's main purpose should be to celebrate the majesty of the king and his family. Henry ensured that the Tudor coat of arms was emblazoned on buildings, charters, and the liveries of those who served him. He undertook regular progresses throughout the countryside, so that he would be seen and adored by his subjects, and issued large coins that showed him sitting on his throne, wearing his crown. He brought about improvements to several royal residences, such as Windsor Castle and the Tower of London, building new towers and making the royal lodgings more comfortable and more resplendent. These royal palaces were adorned with new tapestries, jewels and silver, and gold plate that cost many thousands of pounds. Henry also regularly issued royal proclamations that emphasized both his right to rule and his obligations as king. Part of realizing the Tudor concept of kingship was to ensure that loyalty was given to the king rather than to great nobles of the realm. A century of weak and impoverished kings enabled aristocrats throughout England to rule their countries as virtual kings, a practice known as provincialism. Nobles amassed large affinities composed of men who swore fealty to them and were willing to wear the noble's crest on their liveries, uniforms, and to battle when needed. Furthermore, the provincial aristocrats had managed to use their power, wealth, and patronage to sway various judicial proceedings in their favor and in that of their supporters. The very rule of law and the concept of impartial justice were in jeopardy as parties in disputes resorted to whims of provincial despots rather than to the king and his institutions of justice. Some of the problems of provincialism were eased by 1485 because a number of noble families died off during and in the aftermath of the War of the Roses. Throughout his reign, Henry also managed to keep the problem in check by limiting creations to the nobility. By the end of his reign, the number of noble families had dropped to about 40, which also meant that much Yorkist land that had reverted to the crown over the course of the wars remained in Henry's hands. These could be used for judicious distribution to nobles who proved themselves loyal, or they could be kept by the king to help finance his new monarchy, as he retained the rents they brought in. Henry's first step to limiting provincial power of nobles was through the parliamentary statute against liveries. This law made it illegal for nobles to amass private armies for the primary reason that these armies could be directed against the king. Instead, Henry arranged for the use of commissions of array, which required aristocrats appointed by the king in each country to, when so ordered, recruit and train an army in the king's name. Although consistent with ancient feudal practice, they were to pay for the men at their own expense. Henry also required his nobles to swear fealty directly to him, promising to uphold royal proclamations and not to support or attempt any riots or foment violence against the king. He forced those of the nobility whose loyalty was not entirely clear to enter into recognizances, promising they would, in essence, be of good behavior and follow the king's instructions, otherwise they would forfeit large fines. Henry also issued additional commissions to country gentlemen, later known as Lords Lieutenant, in order to distribute power in the provinces more broadly and limit that of a smaller number of great nobles. In addition to limiting provincialism, the new monarchy required a sophisticated infrastructure to ensure the smooth running of the court and proper display of royal majesty. Under Henry VII, the court came to number several hundred employees, whose job was to provide for all the possible needs of the king and his family, courtiers, and guests. The king enhanced the three household departments that already existed. The, quote, household above stairs, end quote, was run by the Lord Chamberlain, who was nearly always a member of the aristocracy. He ran the presence chamber, where the king officially met dignitaries, courtiers, and petitioners while enthroned. He was also in charge of a new creation of Henry, the privy chamber, which was also staffed by numerous ushers and grooms. This was a private apartment for the king to meet with his royal advisers. The chamberlain also had authority over the king's living quarters and bedchamber, which was run by the groom of the stool, a gentleman who had the intimate privilege of assisting in the king's toileting. The privy chamber also housed the king's private treasury, overseen by the keeper of the privy purse, and clothes, furniture, weapons, and armor, procured and maintained by a department known as the Great Wardrobe. In both chambers, Henry was protected by another creation of his, the Yeomen of the Guard, his corps of personal bodyguards. This guard protected the king from assassination and had the added benefit of emphasizing the grandeur of monarchy. The, quote, household below the stairs, end quote, was operated by the Lord Stuart, also a noble, who had numerous masters working under his supervision. The steward and his deputy, the comptroller, usually a knight, were responsible for ensuring that the physical needs of the members of court were met, and therefore had hundreds of staff who butchered, cooked, cleaned, laundered, sewed, and performed dozens of other mundane but necessary tasks. Low-ranking members of this household would rarely, if ever, set eyes on the king or powerful courtiers, and a series of private narrow staircases and doors hidden behind walls and tapestries ensured that the court employees could move unobtrusively throughout the palace to undertake their duties. The third major unit of court was the, quote, outside department, end quote, run by various masters, such as those of the horse, hound, and falcons. These men were usually knights or gentlemen. The outside department was responsible to keep the stables, erect tents, organize revelries and hunts, and run tournaments that became especially important with the Tudor recovery of chivalric games such as jousting and sword fighting. As the king was peripatetic, moving among various palaces and county progresses throughout the year, many members of the court traveled with his entourage, a large gathering that also demonstrated the king's great majesty. Although Henry the VII did not create any of these three branches of the royal household, each experienced a degree of innovation that reflected a newer and stronger approach to kingship that continued throughout the Tudor period. Government under Henry VII. Henry VII's approach to the workings of government was also critical to his success in restoring luster and authority to monarchy. Ever since the Statute of Prerogativa Regis in the reign of Edward I, circa 1300, the king had been endowed with a wide range of royal prerogative rights that enabled him to govern in the best interest of the Commonwealth. He had the authority to create nobles and knights, declare war and peace, select and dismiss councillors and magistrates, engage in foreign affairs. I'm sorry. I don't know where I left off. Sorry, I had the sniffles. He had the authority to create nobles and knights, declare war and peace, select and dismiss councillors and magistrates, engage in foreign affairs, call and dismiss parliament, issue proclamations, and enforce feudal obligations between the king and his tenants. Despite his divinely granted status and his, quote, angel intelligence, end quote, the king was expected to rule with respect to the ancient laws of the land and as much as possible consistent with his rights of sovereignty with the consent of the governed. Assisting the king in the exercise of these prerogatives within the confines of the law were several important governmental bodies. One of these bodies was the King's Royal Council. Whereas the council before 1485 tended to be a large and unwieldy body composed of nobles, knights, and crown officials, numbering 100 or more, Henry limited its membership to about 20 active councillors, a smaller and more effective body that could remain loyal to the king, though not so small that individual members would be able to wield exceptional power. It was composed of the heads of the royal household, other branches of government and the church, and the law courts, together with individuals specifically appointed by the king to serve as his counselors. The council was responsible for the day-to-day administration of the realm. It handled a wide range of issues such as drafting royal proclamations, issuing charters and orders to administer royal lands, overseeing county affairs and local officials, assisting in matters of diplomacy and peace, hearing petitions and appeals from the king's subjects, and issuing, quote, orders in council, end quote, in the name of the king. It also oversaw two subsidiary bodies, the Council of Wales and the Marches, and the Council of the North, both initially established by Edward IV and strengthened under Henry VII, to improve governmental control over the west and north parts of England. At some point, the council began meeting at a court of Star Chamber and heard legal disputes, usually ones directly involving the security of the realm, such as riot, conspiracy, treason, forgery, and perjury. Many nobles were brought before the council's court and questioned, often by the king himself, about their compliance with royal orders. Because it was technically part of the king's household, the council also regularly moved about with the court. It quickly became the administrative arm of the crown and the practical source of sovereign authority for the English state. By the mid-16th century, it was routinely referred to as the Privy Council. Two other important branches of government were the Chancery and the Exchequer. Chancery was run by perhaps the most important royal official in England, the Lord Chancellor, also a key member of the King's Council. The Chancellor possessed the Great Seal of England, which was applied to land charters, parliamentary legislation, and royal proclamations, thereby giving them the force of the king's authority. By 1485, Chancery had also developed into a, quote, equity court, end quote, which was responsible to provide remedies for legal issues that could not be addressed in a common law court, in theory using the residual powers possessed by the king as the, quote, fount of all justice, end quote. The Exchequer, run by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was responsible for all royal finances and were not part of the king's personal treasury, primarily the collection accounting of taxation money. The Exchequer also held its own law court to collect monies owed to the crown. One of the problems Henry observed with the Exchequer was the ponderous slowness with which accounting was completed. The inability of the Exchequer to keep Henry fully aware of his financial situation at any given time compelled the king to place more and more authority in the hands of his personal treasurers to handle the finances that helped fund the court. The two royal common law courts, the Court of King's Bench and Court of Common Pleas, which each staffed by their own chief justices, were also usually members of the King's Council and lesser or Puisne. Puist. Pronounced Puni. Okay, it says right here. Judges. I don't know if it's puny. Puny judges were also institutions of government that had, by 1485, come into some disrepute as a result of provincialism and archaism. King's Bench, in theory, handled criminal and civil cases touching the king or the physical bodies of his subjects, such as treason and murder. Common Pleas focused on civil cases involving ordinary subjects, including property, contract, debt, and injury. Both these courts applied a rigorous form of common law, which was based on precedents created by previous court cases. By the beginning of the Tudor era, these courts had gained reputations for being tediously slow, overly technical in their procedure, and extremely expensive to initiate a lawsuit. It was these problems that caused the creation of the equity courts of Chancery, and in about 1494 a subsidiary court of the council, later known as the Court of Request. The final major branch of government that assisted the king in governing was the bicameral parliament. As we have seen, the House of Lords consisted of all members of the temporal and spiritual nobility, about 100 men in total. The House of Commons was a body elected by 40-shilling freeholders, 3 to 5% of the male population, and consisted of two, quote, knights of the shire, end quote, from each country, and, quote, 2 burgesses, end quote, from each of about 120 incorporated towns and cities, totaling about 300 members of Parliament. The right to summon, prorogue, or dissolve Parliament fell to the king's prerogative. Unlike modern parliaments, which sit regularly with a body of professional politicians, early modern parliaments met on average every 3 to 5 years, such that its members did not develop professional status or institutional memory. As its members, in theory, represented their constituents by attorney, Parliament was the primary institution of government that ensured the king ruled through consent of the governed. Meetings of Parliament enabled its members to challenge or question royal policies made through proclamation or otherwise, and to petition the king for redress of grievance. Parliament had two primary functions in the early modern period: legislation and taxation. Legislation was usually passed to this body by the King's Council for discussion and ratification in each of the two houses before it was ultimately approved by the King and sealed by the Chancellor, at which point it became statute law that was subject to enforcement. In theory, either house was free to initiate its own legislation, even if it was against the wishes of the King or his government, but the King was equally free to exercise his prerogative right to veto the bill before it became an act, in which case it never became law. Because at this time, the king had the power to issue proclamations within certain limitations. Legislation served the purpose of gaining, quote, every man's consent, end quote, to some of Henry's and his successors' more contentious practices. An excellent example of this is the passage of the statute against liveries, because it was ratified by the very men it was most likely to affect, nobles, knights, and gentlemen. It had stronger force than an edict from the kings might have had. The second function of Parliament was to improve taxation among the people of England. Although the king had wide-ranging powers to issue proclamations on nearly any subject, common law severely restricted his ability to exact taxes, which in theory were only needed in times of emergency such as war. Naturally, a king who emulated a new theory of Tudor kingship, such as Henry VII, was not to be questioned too thoroughly about his policies, but he still recognized the importance of gaining at least a semblance of consent by calling Parliament on a fairly regular basis. In all, Henry called 7 parliaments between 1485 and 1509, which was broadly consistent with the frequency with which Parliament had been called for 2 centuries, although none lasted more than a single session. That is, there were no prorogations, a sign of Henry's and his council's increasing authority in what has been referred to as, quote, Tudor despotism, end quote, is the fact that he called only 2 parliaments in his last 14 years as king, and each lasted only about 8 days. In his last parliament in 1504, Henry asked its members to renew and strengthen the statute against liveries, once again forcing its members to, in effect, legislate against their own personal interests. Fiscal feudalism. One reason Henry called so few parliaments in the second half of his reign has to do with his approach to crown finances. Over the previous century, provincialism, corruption of local officials, and war had led increasingly to the impoverishment and indebtedness of the crown, a condition that Henry worked hard to improve. In this he was very successful. His ability to live off his own means also meant that he needed to rely less and less on Parliament's powers of taxation, or, quote, extraordinary, end quote, income. In theory, a king should have been able to fund his entire court on his, quote, ordinary, end quote, income, which derived from several sources. The king owned large parcels of property that he did not distribute to tenants, which provided him with an annual income through rents. As a result of lands that reverted to the crown after Henry had dealt with his noble enemies, crown lands yielded much higher profits than previously. The king was also entitled to the revenue collected by the customs office from goods both imported into and exported from England. During the Wars of the Roses, trade had declined considerably, as had customs revenue. With peace came prosperity and the ability to renew trade with foreign powers and increase this important revenue source. Henry's greatest and most controversial financial triumph came from the recovery of what was known as, quote, fiscal feudalism, end quote. Historically, as head of the feudal society, the king could exact from his tenants-in-chief, nobles and knights, various feudal fees. These collections had fallen into abeyance over the previous century, or, because of provincialism, had fallen into the hands of nobles rather than the king's treasury. The king recovered, for instance, his rights to wardship, or the right to administer and collect the profits and rents from land held by minor or female heirs until they reached the age of majority or married. He also collected reliefs, aids, and incidents or fees associated with land transferred upon the death of its occupants, the marriage of his wards, the creation of a deceased knight's son to his father's title. The king also had the feudal right to collect fees when his eldest son was knighted, or when his daughter was married. Henry demanded both in 1504, when his daughter Margaret married King James. When his daughter Margaret married King James IV of Scotland. Even though Arthur had been knighted 15 years earlier and had been dead for 2 years, Parliament offered Henry £40,000, a considerable sum at the time, if he would refrain from inspecting ancient land tenure obligations to determine his feudal entitlements. Finally, Henry had Parliament pass penal statutes that allowed him to collect fines for various infractions and employed commissioners to tour the countries looking for victims of his strict fiscal feudal policies. In total, Henry managed through these various means to increase crown annual finances from about £50,000 when he claimed the throne to closer to £120,000 by 1509. This enabled him to live an extravagant life while relieving himself of the need to call Parliament for regular infusion of cash. It is his financial avarice that has given Henry a poor reputation among early modern commentators, although Henry operated within the confines of the law to increase revenues that helped to strengthen his reign and secure his dynasty. As a result, when the crown passed to Henry VIII in 1509, his father having died of tuberculosis that April, the new king inherited a full treasury. To appease his noble subjects who thought his father excessively avaricious, however, Henry started his reign by imprisoning and later executing 2 of his father's more successful revenue collectors, Edmund Dudley and Sir Richard Empson. Like his father's, Henry VIII's reign started in bloodshed. Discussion question 1.4. In what ways did Henry's reforms in government and his use of fiscal feudalism help to secure the Tudor dynasty from further challenges? This is in the back of the chapter's over, and now there's a Voices of the Past, the execution of Perkin Warbeck. The claims of Perkin Warbeck represented the last significant challenge to Henry VII's crown. Warbeck arrived in England in 1491, claiming that he was Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes believed to have been murdered in the Tower of London by Richard III. Henry initially spared Warbeck after his capture in 1497, but when Warbeck tried to escape to the continent, Henry committed him to the Tower of London. An attempted escape in 1499, coupled with rumors of Warbeck's renewed plans to claim the throne, finally forced the king to order the impostor's execution. The following extract records Warbeck's history from his first attempt at escape until his execution. Now began the fateful day of the death of Perkin Warbeck to approach. Perkin, whether it grieved him to be kept inward, at close guard, or else that he was instigated and enlisted by some of his old friends to stir more coals, begin some new seditious faction, studied how to escape and fly away, and convey himself out of the Englishman's hands, and so deceiving his keepers, he took him to his heels, by which he brought himself into a straighter custody and prison, and wrapped himself into tortures and punishments. For, when the rumor of his flight was spread abroad, every byway and lane was set with the king's guard. Wherefore, he being sore abashed with the clamor of them that searched and made inquiry of him, and being in manner destitute of wit and counsel, altered of necessity from his plans, and came to the priory of Sheer beside Richmond, and committed himself to the prior of the monastery, requiring him for God's sake to ask and desire his life and pardon of the king's majesty. The prior, moved with the calamity and unfortunate state of this man, came to the king and showed him this Perkin, whose pardon he humbly craved and frankly obtained it. Perkin was brought to the courts again to Westminster with many a curse and reproach, and was one day set fettered in a pair of stocks before the door of Westminster Hall, and there he stood a whole day, not without innumerable reproaches, mocks, and scornings. The next day he was carried through London and set upon the stocks as he occupied the day before, and there stood all day and read openly his own confession written by his own hand. When night of the same day was come, partly because the king had pardoned him his life, and partly because he should no more run away and put the king in doubt of any mistrust or misfortune to come, he was committed to the Tower of London, where his wickedness boiling so hot within his stomach would not suffer him to escape the punishment and vengeance of God. Perkin, being now in hold, began to study which way to fly and escape. For he by false persuasion and liberal promises corrupted his gaolers, in so much that they, as it was at their arraignment openly proved, intended to have slain Sir John Digby, lieutenant of the Tower, and to have set Perkin and the Earl of Warwick at large, which earl was by them made privy of this enterprise, and thereunto to his destruction assented. But this crafty device and subtle imagination, open and disclosed, he being repulsed and put back from all hope and good luck with all his accomplices and confederates. On the 23 day of the same month, November 23rd, 1499, Perkin was drawn to Tyburn, and there, standing on a little scaffold, read his confession, asked the king's forgiveness, and died penitently. Footnote: Tyburn was then a village located at the northeast corner of present-day Hyde Park, most famous for the public gallows used to hang criminals in London until 1783. End footnote. This was the reward of Perkin Warbeck, which, as in his life, with false persuasions and untrue surmises, had brought many noble personages to death and utter perdition. So at his death he brought with him other of the same sort to their not undeserved punishment. The source was Edward Hall, the union of the two noble and illustre families of Lancaster and York. Discussion question 1.5. Why do you think that despite Perkin Warbeck's treasonous acts, his detailed confession, and an escape attempt, Henry VII initially had the impostor imprisoned instead of executed?